we have Dr. Fadel Ndiame, the Senior Advisor of the President of AGRA. You're based in Kenya, Nairobi.
Yes, madam.
Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So first and foremost, as AGRA, have you made any connections? I guess, what have you extracted from the Brazil-Africa Forum this year?
Firstly, I was very pleased to be part of this forum, which really showed the opportunities of partnership between Africa and Brazil. Being an African organization on the continent, totally focused on working with smallholder farmers, private sector and government to drive agricultural transformation. Brazil is certainly a very good opportunity given the impressive record of this country in transforming this agriculture. So I had the privilege of meeting with Professor Bosco, who was also at our own meeting recently organized in Accra. Obviously, we engaged with NEPAD, FARA, which are sister organizations. I also had an opportunity to meet many other African ministers, especially the one from Nigeria, with whom we normally do business. I think, but finding them in Brazil had something unique about it, because we can all talk about how we can promote a win-win partnership between Africa and Brazil.
Mm. So for investors who are afraid, I guess, to get into the African market, specifically in agriculture, what do you have to say to them?
So if you are an investor, it means you are in the business of making money out of taking risk.
For sure.
So I think what we can tell them is just give them the fact is Africa is probably one of the largest continents, which have most of the arable land on earth. We have 55 countries, which have each of them unique policy and investment environment. But you have some common feature, which is agriculture is extremely important. The continent is still importing food, which from an investor means there are opportunity to have import substitution, which means to invest in production that will enable you to regain local market. But the thing I would really emphasize is Africa just adopted the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which will make Africa the biggest market in the world. So I think Africa is the place where everybody wants to be if you are really serious about making money. So that's basically my message. Obviously, I will give them a bit more facts and profile by country, by value chain, depending on their area of interest. I think it's really a win-win opportunity.
Mm. So what conversations are we not having about agriculture?
I like that question. I didn't expect that. Firstly, I think it's a very complex sector. And I think I mentioned it earlier in my discussion. There is no blueprint. Many people think that there is a solution that you can find somewhere and just deploy it. Africa is much bigger and much more diverse, which means for you to do business, you need to understand the landscape. You actually need to understand the ecosystem and be able to build a value proposition in that ecosystem. Now, if you are in Brazil, it means you are already in a tropical environment, which means most of the crops and commodity that you grow here can grow in Africa. But still, you need to understand a bit more the policy landscape, because you need some policy predictability. You also need to understand what are the infrastructure requirements. You also need to have a good sense of what is the local market and the local entrepreneurs in Africa are. Because you really need to be able to connect to the local ecosystem for you to promote win-win partnership. I think more conversation like what we're having here yesterday with having more youth. I was very pleased to see young people coming in. Having more private sector, public sector will create the kind of understanding that enable business to thrive between the two continents.
Mm. So let's talk about finance, access to finance for entrepreneurs in the agriculture space. Do you think there's enough finance being dispatched?
Obviously, no, given what everybody's saying. But also, if you look at the statistics, I think somebody was mentioning that probably if you take it roughly speaking, agriculture contributes at least for 20% of the GDP on the continent. But the share of agricultural finance that goes to agriculture is less than 5%, which gives you a good sense. Now, the reason why you have this is agriculture is perceived as being risky. Banks have other alternatives. It's easier for them to lend to sectors that are more structured, that they understand much better. I think to add to the complexity, in Africa you have a smallholder-dominated agriculture, which brings specific challenges linked to how small, scattered, and undercapitalized they are. Therefore, the cost of serving them is very high. Now, the good news is this is changing. Firstly, I think the most important progress we can highlight here is the African leadership at the continent level has taken some decision to prioritize agriculture. I think CADEP is probably one of the most important policy and political framework that show the commitment of the continent to make agriculture at the heart of our transformation. But more importantly, the decision makers are also assessing their own progress. You know, CADEP was launched in 2003, but more recent in 2015, you have the Malabo Declaration, where the leadership sat down to review progress, to acknowledge the shortcoming, but set up very stringent accountability requirements by which we can track progress. So I think you are seeing on the continent, I mean, there are many countries that are known. I mean, people will always tell you Rwanda, Ethiopia, but even countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, Ghana are making significant progress from a very low resource base. The reason is because the majority of our people in agriculture. So there is no way you can neglect a sector that occupies the majority of your people. Second, the continent is still importing food from outside the continent, whereas we have most of the resources here. So the opportunity to grow locally, process and transform and create jobs is very appealing. And this is why you are seeing a lot of partnership between government and the private sector, because you can't unlock that opportunity if you don't create the condition for the private sector. I think the issue of financing should be approached from that point of view, because some of those private sector have a very good credit profile, if I can say, because they are very well structured. They have bank account. Also, they have done many transactions which make it easy for a bank to assess their risk profile. The challenge is with the smallholder farmers, who generally are scattered, don't have collateral. But even with them, new financial products are being created by banks, but also by non-financial institutions, using mainly the power of digitalization, which enable you today to profile farmers, to understand the size of their holding, to understand their pattern of operation, their income stream. On the basis of that, now banks and financial institutions are able to provide them with the right financing. But it cannot be a one solution. It has to be a much more complex approach by which you need public investment in infrastructure, in research, in markets, policy that are predictable, that make it attractive for people to invest in agriculture, but also support to research and innovation, because our smallholder farmers are still producing at a very low level. So there is margin for improvement. If you have surplus production that meet quality requirement of the markets, and they are linked to professional, small and medium scale enterprises, you have a case for a platform for wealth creation. I think you have many of these initiatives taking place across the continent.
I mean, we've spoken about the challenges, poor infrastructure, I guess, access to finance, access to markets. But now, what is the future of agriculture? I know it's a broad term, but what is the future of agriculture in Africa? You've spoken about implementation of digital technology in the sector. Where are we going?
I think where we're going is agriculture is so important that it has to take precedent. It has to have really to be elevated at the highest level. And we are seeing it in many countries where at the level of the head of state, they are paying attention to agriculture. Let's take the case of Rwanda. Rwanda is very well known. Within a very short period of time, less than 20 years, they have completely almost reduced rural poverty by a significant margin. Ethiopia is also known. I mentioned Ghana. So it's not only few, but more countries are coming. I think we understand better what are the requirements for agriculture to work. Firstly, you need to have political commitment at the highest level. You cannot just treat agriculture as a social sector where you are helping. You need to see it as a business, as a sector that will drive jobs, but also wealth creation, given the magnitude of the people who are in that sector. That political will should translate into a long-term vision of how agriculture will contribute to progress. This typically materialize, NEPAD, the Africa Union, and the regional economic communities are working with countries to help them design what they call the National Agricultural Investment Plan.
Okay.
That plan is what is like your business plan. This gives you a very clear roadmap as to how you're going to deliver progress. But those plans need to be prioritized, because if you don't have a lot of resources, you need to prioritize the most important value chain or sector that are likely to deliver. Around those plans now you can mobilize national resources. Government has to commit resources. One of the commitment of African countries as part of the CADEP is to devote at least 10% of their budget to agriculture. Some countries are doing more. Mali is doing 15% now, despite being a Sahelian country. But that was probably the most significant testimony of your commitment to your sector. If you take national wealth and put it into infrastructure, research, innovation, etc. Once you do that, that creates the framework for private sector investment. And the first private sector are the smallholder farmers themselves, because they are investing their own money, their time to produce. Now, a complete investment will require managing the full value chain. This is now where we're talking about beyond primary production. We need to add value, process, package, and distribute, not only for the local, national, but also for the regional and continental market. One of the promising opportunity is the enactment of the African Free Trade Agreement that will make Africa the biggest market in the world, with more than 1.2 billion consumers. This makes Africa the solution. But for this to happen, we have to execute. You need the proper policy. You need to create the incentive for this value chain to be structured, for trade to happen across African countries and African region, as opposed to the current situation where very little trade is happening within Africa. We mostly trade with outside of Africa. But those will be enabled and facilitated by the investment we mentioned earlier. Harmonization of policy, infrastructure, research, innovation. And the biggest argument are we will have economies of scale. Because instead of dealing with a market of 10 million consumers, we are talking about a market of 200, 300 million. From an economic point of view, this is probably a much more promising prospect. So I'm very optimistic about the opportunity, but it requires execution. We have to walk the talk.
Yeah.
This is where we need leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. And then lastly, before I let you go, what is your organization, AGRA, doing to promote the South-to-South cooperation?
Firstly, AGRA, I think, is very well positioned in this agenda because we are an African-led and African-centered organization. And our purpose is really to make smallholder farmer, which represent the most important segment of agriculture in Africa, at the heart of our economic progress. Our work is really through partnership with government, with farmers, with private sector, but also with development partners, so that we can help drive the transformation required on this continent, which means increasing significantly productivity of smallholder farming to the point that we can have reliable surpluses. Secondly, making sure that you have proper markets, proper financing, infrastructure, all the conditions required for agriculture to really unlock value for all the players. Now, for this to happen, you need, as we mentioned earlier, policies that are conducive, that create the incentive for farmers to invest, but also for private sector to work with farmers. We need a better coordination of effort across ministry, because agriculture is not only the matter of the Ministry of Agriculture, because we're talking about local government, we're talking about natural resources, Ministry of Finance. So for us to be able to drive impact, you need to facilitate coordination across the ministerial department, but also coordination with non-state actors, with the private sector and civil society, especially in the context of climate change, where some group needs some special support in order to be able to adapt. Once this is done, you also need to bring on board the donors, the development partners, whose effort should be fully aligned to the priorities of the countries. Because once you have the leadership from government and the commitment and the accountability framework, it becomes easier to mobilize external support. And the final point would be around accountability. And I think a good example of accountability is as part of the Malabo Declaration, African countries have committed themselves to the peer review mechanism and to the biannual review by which each country track how well they are doing. They can also learn from what other countries are doing better, so that as a continent, we keep up to the political agenda of a unified and prosperous Africa, as it has been articulated in the Agenda 2063. So that's the vision, and that's where we are heading. My organization is part of that whole process. We are supporting, working with government to strengthen their capacity to lead this whole process. We are also helping build a delivery system that makes sure that the smallholder farmers have access to finance, to information, to all the resources they require in order to produce. Finally, we are also facilitating the work with donors so that you have a better coordination of their investment. All of this in order for us to have impact at scale.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Ndiame. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you. And
Thank
good
you so
luck
much.
with your
Thank you.
meetings.
Thank you.
Thank you.